So I found something very interesting. This book, Southern Rhodesia, A Field for Investment, was a little booklet which was an open invitation to anybody who was willing and able by the Rhodesian government at the time to come and invest in that country, which today is modern day Zimbabwe. This book that was stolen by my father from investors who were looking to just burn down that library was an interesting insight into how they operated and how they viewed themselves. The reason why I am doing this is because for the longest time, Zimbabwe has always been seen as the country that has bread costing up north of $1 trillion and been ridiculed for it. We are the quintessential example for hyperinflation, more so than other nations. So it is far detached from its previous record or reputation as being the breadbasket of Africa. This little book, however, details what the colonists had in view or what potential they saw in the country when it was still just dust and gravel. In this series, I want to look at each chapter in each episode and investigate what they detailed in the book, the language that they used, their mentality at the time, what they thought would be beneficial to the nation, and how they approached development. So, welcome to my first episode of this book. The first chapter, Young and Enterprising, is nothing particularly special pertaining to what the rest of the book is about, but it does have some very interesting information to tell us. So this first chapter details the location of the country, its population, its neighbors, but then where it puts most of its focus is in two areas. The first is Rhodesia, the government, and its association and relationship with the UK. At the time, the UK was still trying to keep as much control over the colonies as much as possible, but these governing bodies that would then go and colonize said areas wanted freedom of their own, and Rhodesia was no different. So, in the first chapter, they list two areas in governments in which they had no control over. The first being international relations and issues to do with foreign policy. Being a member of the Commonwealth and being such a small nation, that's how they put it, it seemed logical for them to hand over such a responsibility to a well-known authority, of which it did make sense because the UK's relationship with the US did help Rhodesia's development in creating a favorable environment for investment. The other area of legislation the area of governance that Southern Rhodesia had no control over was the issue of treatment of the natives. According to this book, no rule or legislation pertaining to the treatment of native people, which was mostly blacks, was dictated by the House of Windsor, and any independent government which was under the Commonwealth could not do anything about that. They would have to run it through the Queen first. But then they then go on to firmly reiterate that they are masters in their own home and that any agreement or policy pertaining to trade was their own. And on the flip side, then they would have this conversation about how they developed or came to rescue the black man. This had been 60 years. This book was printed in 1950, which is 30 years before the country's independence. This had been 60 years since they arrived into the country, and they described us, and I'm not kidding you, as barbaric, lacking in culture, had no semblance of handwriting, and were completely backward. Another interesting phrase they used was that for as much development as they have made, you cannot turn back centuries of backward behavior with a stroke of a pen, which showed their condescending attitude towards the locals, towards the natives. They also did, I found this rather ironic, that they would then impose themselves as the authority which was best suited to rule a nation, when then themselves were subject to such pressure, which was coming from the UK, where they were not deemed the appropriate or necessary party that would then be able to govern a new nation. The queen thought that she would be better at it. And in the same vein, they would look at the natives, the Shona people, and say that, hey, we are the ones to bring you out of this. And they would often describe us as the brutes, as the ground workers, and them as the intelligent and skilled people who would then guide us to exploiting our land. Highlighted in this document, I think, which might have been favorable for investment at that time, was that natives only occupied about a third of their land. Yeah, we were segregated to only about, I think, 500,000 square kilometers from the rest of the nation, whereas the whites could roam around as they wish, and we were only allowed to interact in the areas that they occupied when we were either going to work or to, if we're summoned there for some reason. But I think that this very first chapter laid the groundwork for how or what the world deemed as a appropriate or attractive environment for investing, considering that the segregation, or at least the attitude towards individuals of a different race, was very, very negative and did not allow for any consideration above us being workhorses. It seemed rather important that you highlight how much control you had over the population, but still, considering the nature of the times and how geopolitical relations were still happening and how colonization played a large role in many parts of the world, it seemed rather important to also be able to state whether or not you as a nation had control over your own policies and how far that control was extended. So this was the first chapter of the book, and I hope that you stay with me on this series and we could discuss more about what happened. And I'll post these pages and these documents on a separate website, and you could go over them, read them, and we could talk about them in the next chapter.